for a prop like this, one of the things I recommend, and it's something I wind up frequently doing, is deleting history. So I can see all the inputs over here, right? So these are all your edits in history, including all the UV edits. It's very important too, especially when you go into animation, things like that, that you delete the history. So for me, the shortcut, which is the default, is Alt-Shift-D. That'll clear that history. Now it looks like, are these a bunch of extrusions, I guess? A lot of extrusions, which is pretty impressive. It's a lot of really good detail work, right? So one of the simplest things I recommend. Now, just another mention too here is on the left side, right? We get a lot of selection sets. So these sets are actually created by Maya when you edit, pull mesh and vertices and other things around. So a lot of times too, if I'm working on a single object and I get these additional sets, after you've deleted history, you can usually safely delete those sets. You get a much cleaner scene. Okay, now moving on to the unwrap, I'm just going to apply a standard Lambert. And then under the Lambert, I'll click on the checker box and add a checker material. And then I usually like to make it a kind of light gray or medium gray and white. And under the place 2D texture, so this is basically showing how many times the texture is repeated. More often lately, I've been setting this to 30 by 30. You want to keep it an even number so that you can see if there's distortion. You can tell there's distortion on the object when these checkers are stretched. So that is telling you that the pixels, when applied to this as a texture, will be stretched on the object, okay? So the idea is to get as distortion-free of a UV unwrap for this. In a more intensive production environment, I would spend my time and cut apart little pieces, things like this face. I would probably extend this. Let me just hit 5 on the keyboard so we can just see the flat material. So I'd keep things like this area together. And then maybe split that area off, and then this would be another section here. Okay. But I'm going to show you a really, really quick and easy way to get a good clean UV on this thing. So literally just go to UV, automatic, right? So it basically puts a box around this thing, and you wind up getting a nice even checker on everything. Now the downside to this, I probably mentioned in other classes, is you wind up getting a ton of little pieces, right? So sometimes you'll get a whole bunch of little squares. So that can be a little bit problematic, but for a preliminary unwrap, that's pretty much okay, at least for the virtual worlds assignment when you're doing just a quick pass through. It used to be a big problem too when we had a bunch of little islands like this or a bunch of little clusters that, it'd be hard to paint across them because of all the little seams. Because of software like ZBrush, Substance Painter, Mari, you can paint across those seams because you're painting directly on the mesh in a sense and outputting like a 2D, it could be a JPEG, a TIFF, a Targa, an EXR file, or whatever it is. So those seams are less of an issue. I still prefer to keep my clusters as clean and continuous as possible. So what I mean by that, for example, is let's say across this little section, it goes all the way through here, right? So I'd probably want to only split that in maybe one corner and be a long strip, whereas the automatic breaks it up into a bunch of little pieces, right? So sometimes I'll start with an automatic unwrap. Okay. If I go back into the UV editor. By the way, I generally prefer my UV kit to be docked into my window, so you can just kind of drag that over into there. And if you do want to start, really going into that level of detail, you can basically find those pieces of the shell in here. You can actually isolate them just like you can in the viewport. If you click inside the UV editor, you can hit Control-1, and then you can basically grab the longer edge and say right-click, move and sew. Select this, move and sew. And what it's going to do is start to create a more extended, connected piece, right? So just like in the My Viewport, if you hold Shift right-click, most of your major editing tools are here. Cut, sew, unfold. In this case, I want to do move and sew. You could also do sew, but sew can stretch it across the editor. So I like to do move and sew instead. Now, like I said, for the Virtual Worlds project, I don't expect you guys to go to that level of detail. Literally doing an automatic can be almost good enough, or mostly good enough in certain cases. There's one other issue here that I want to mention. Does anybody know what that issue might be? Seams, yes, but anything else? Scaling, right? So if you take a look, this checker is stretched. It should be square. And like I said, any distortion away from a square, even texture across the surface is an indication there's a distortion in either the mesh or the UVs. Usually it's in the mesh, which then affects the UVs. So what the automatic tool and any of the other unwrapping tools like cylinders, there's a camera-based. We'll talk a bit about that. There's the ones I mainly use are here. I don't even know what normal base does yet. I'd have to take a look, but you can even try auto seams. But again, these are some tools I haven't quite used yet. But if you go into scale, let's say I set this to 1, you see the checker looks square because it's actually looking at the object without scaling. This is one of the reasons I mentioned before, when you scale things, it's good to go in and grab the vertices or the edges or the polygons and scale them at that level so it doesn't record it permanently at the object level, right? So it's vertex or sub-object level, not object or transform level. To fix this though, you simply go into Modify, and again, if you have objects in a scene, they're rotated and maybe they're moved into a different position, you'll want to go into Freeze Transforms into the settings. And make sure you just simply freeze scaling. So freeze scaling, what it's going to do is make it look like this thing hasn't been scaled. It'll reset the XYZ to look as if it's 100% XYZ. Now again, I'm going to quickly delete my history, Alt-Shift-D. If I go back to UV and go to automatic, now you should basically get distortion-free checker display. So even on a complex object, this can work fairly well in your scenes. Like I said, it's not exactly ideal, especially if you wind up having to hand paint or touch something up in, let me just hit Control-1 again, by the way, to unhide all that stuff. You know, it's not ideal to have all these little shells and clusters, but, you know, sometimes I wind up splitting certain faces, so I may say, you know what, I'll take these faces and break this off, because there's a big open cavity there, right? There's a big opening here. So I might split these two ends off, create a shell there. And that way, if I select everything, shift right click, go to layout, it's telling me there's also some non-manifold geometry. The tool can automatically fix some of these mesh errors. It basically means that you might have a third polygon in between two flat polygons, which would technically be sort of illegal mesh. So this would try to fix that issue. So we'll let it sort of calculate and relay things out. So sometimes when you have big long pieces and they're attached, you may have to break them off. So like I think the legs and the front face of this table are connected. So sometimes I strategically break off certain parts. I'll strategically weld or move and sew other parts together depending on the situation. And so that's a pretty simple strategy. For me, the main idea with UVs is that whenever there's a major angle change is usually an indication that you need to put a seam there, right? So on this table, this whole top flat side would probably be one big shell. And then as soon as we get to that handle, it could be another whole shell. And then the sides here would be another shell. And the software will highlight those UV shells in white, right? So it's showing you the borders or the edges where the UVs are split. So as you can see, I've further split this piece up. So if I highlight all the faces now, there aren't as many big voids or cavities, right? So sometimes when you have a huge piece, this one actually fits nicely in, this shell, for example. But let's say that shell, let me just move it over. If that shell were leaving a big void, then what I'd probably want to do at that point is risk breaking this off or creating a shell and repacking or relaying out that mesh so it better fit. But in this case, I've got a pretty good fit without, without having to break that piece. And the good news is, as well, is that a lot of these front and back side faces are basically coming off as one shell, so it would make for a lot easier painting. So like I said, in some cases you can actually get away with these tiny fragments. I would just be careful because sometimes in a game environment or a film production environment, you'll have your texture artist say, hey, like I can't paint with all these tiny pieces, it's a waste of space. Can you stitch those little interior bits together where they're continuous, right? So you'd have to do what I did earlier and sort of find some of those continuous bits like so, and then try to unwrap that. Or strategically select some mesh. Okay.